For those of you that are new to Panthera, Panthera is the world's leading wildcat organization. We're a public charity, 501c3, based in New York City. We have programs in over 40 countries around the globe, and we work to save all species of wildcats, primarily the 4 largest and most imperiled: lions, tigers, jaguars, and snow leopards. And I'm pleased to introduce Alan Rabinowitz. He's the president and CEO, as well as the co-founder of Panthera. He's one of the world's leading wildcat experts, and he's been called the Indiana Jones of wildlife conservation by Time magazine. He created the first jaguar preserve, established in Belize, and spent years establishing the world's largest tiger reserve in the Hukong Valley in Myanmar. To his side, we've got Dr. Luke Hunter, Panthera's Executive Vice President, who oversees the direction and strategy of all of Panthera's wildcat conservation programs. Luke has contributed to over 100 scientific papers and popular articles, and just completed his 6th book, A Field Guide to Carnivores of the World, which will be released in September 2011, so stay tuned for that. For those of you watching, you're able to submit questions while we're conducting this webinar. We decided to do this because we got tons of questions following a segment that ran on CBS 60 Minutes on January 30th specifically about our Jaguar project in the Pantanal. So we are fielding questions both live, but also a lot of you submitted wonderful questions beforehand, and that's what this webinar is going to be based on. So Alan, we'll start with you.
Okay.
Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us, it's true.
So Alan, can you please give an overview of the project in the Pantanal, what the goals are, and what we have to accomplish there?
Sure. The Pantanal, we selected the Pantanal specifically of Brazil because this is one of the places throughout Jaguar Range which have the highest densities of jaguars. Ironically, or maybe because of that, they also have some of the highest conflict problems, jaguars killing cattle, and we have some of the highest incidents of jaguars being killed down there. It's a very, very important area for jaguars. So our goal down there is at least twofold. It's actually severalfold. One of them is to create a corridor through the Pantanal that is contiguous on private and public lands, so that it's one of the major intact corridors for our Jaguar Corridor throughout Jaguar Range that we'll be talking about. But another very important point was to create a model ranch or a model series of ranches to where we could look very closely under controlled circumstances at what is happening with jaguar cattle conflict. We could look at that and see how to possibly manipulate it, how to help local people, how to help ranchers, and how to work with local communities who are being asked to live with cattle and with jaguars in a way that both jaguars can benefit and the people can benefit.
And it's a perfect example of how it's not an issue of us or them. It's a place where jaguars and people and ranching are coexisting.
Exactly. We know us and them doesn't work in the long run. It's got to be a kind of coexistence.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about why are we focused on jaguars? What are the threats to jaguars? Why do they need our help?
Well, jaguars, as many people probably already know, jaguars are the 3rd largest cat in the world, the largest cat in the Western Hemisphere, one of our top carnivores, our apex predators, so to speak. Now, they are a little less endangered than 2 of the larger cats, tigers and lions. But jaguars are still down to possibly 50% of their historic range. Jaguars are heavily hunted still. People kill them when they find them. Jaguar habitat is being lost at very rapid rates. And many people are killing, if they don't kill jaguar, they're killing jaguar prey, the animals jaguars need to survive. So the threats to jaguars are very intense. And although we still have pretty good numbers of jaguars, and we still seem to have time with jaguars, we can't fall behind. We need to really stay on top of it.
Great. So Luke, we got a ton of questions from people asking how many jaguars exist And this is a challenge that we face across the board of how do you count cats?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The short answer is we don't know how many jaguars there are, and actually, with Panthera, I mean, we often say it's the wrong question because they are difficult to count. And you see these figures out there, which I think are essentially guesswork, but it's the headline figure. A newspaper wants to say 50,000 jaguars left. We don't know. The short answer is we don't actually know how many there are. But Alan already mentioned one of the key ways that we assess the level of threat and what we need to do to address that to cats, and that's the loss of range, the extent of historic versus modern range, and comparing those two. And that's somewhere between 40 to 50% that jaguars have lost in their over recent history. And we know that we're able to do that fairly accurately versus how to count them. That said, I mean, we're now much better at counting big cats, of course, and the best way, I mean, established by Alan and colleagues like Ross Caranth at WCS is with camera traps, is using these remote triggered cameras that we can put out to survey an area or population of big cats. And so long as they're individually recognisable, like jaguars, tigers, leopards, snow leopards and so on, and we can tell who's in the photograph, which individual cat is in the photograph, there's some really nice statistical models that you can apply to just those photographs when they take their own pics, that we can actually come up with really rigorous density estimates. So, for example, Alan said the Pantanal is one of the areas that has the greatest density of jaguars. We know that from camera trapping, and we know how jaguars fare in a number of other habitats from camera trapping and their good estimates. Even with that, it's impossible to say how many there are across their range. We just can't say that.
And camera trapping is wonderful. They are like windows into the forest in terms of what we see from them. So go to our website and check out all the galleries that we have of numerous camera trap photos of cats and prey species and others.
That's right.
So Alan, people were surprised to learn that jaguars are no longer found in the US. Is that true? And then can you also give a sense, we've been talking about range contraction. First of all, where are jaguars found, and why are they no longer found in the US?
Current range is stated to be, current range where jaguars live is stated to be northern Mexico through northern Argentina. At one time, they ranged further south all the way down into Patagonia, or to the edge of Patagonia. At the same time, prehistoric, they resided at places in the United States. There are two things at work here. It is correct to say jaguars occur in the United States in some sense, because records have shown us since the 1900s, jaguars have been spotted, have been photographed, have been tracked periodically at different places in the southwest US. What has not happened is that jaguars have not been found to be breeding or to be residing in any kind of numbers in the United States since the early 1900s, really, and probably before that. There was a jaguar named Macho B that recently was euthanized because it got caught in a trap. It was very, very old. It actually could be the oldest jaguar documented in the wild. It was over 20 years, no, not the 20 years.
15.
Yeah.
It was a minimum of 15.
Yeah.
That's right, 15
Which is old
years.
for a wild jaguar.
Very old for a wild jaguar. Record in captivity, I believe, is 22 years. Do you know?
I think that's about right, yeah.
And that animal had been photographed enough times in the United States over the period of a decade to say it was possibly resident in the United States, so we don't even know that. But there's no data, and there hasn't been any data during historic times to show that jaguars have actually lived in any numbers in the United States or that they have bred in the United States.
So that's in, you'd say, the edge of their range.
It's the edge of their range. It's one of the reasons why Panthera actually fought to put the jaguar on the U.S. endangered species list, because it wasn't until recently. And it does come over into the United States, so it merited being on the endangered species list. However, in my opinion, it doesn't merit much beyond that, because jaguars at this point do not live in the United States, and we have so much to do on jaguars south of that border, south of the United States.
Okay, great. So Luke, part of the segment, the CBS segment, shows, I believe, you and Howard and Alan with Bob Simon, the CBS correspondent, with an anesthetized jaguar collaring the cat. Again, lots of questions. Why do we collar cats? Is this harmful to the cat? What do we learn from collaring individuals? So if you could answer that.
Sure. It's an excellent question. I get asked it a lot, and I think it's a really good question because we want to be really conservative about collaring. We shouldn't just hang collars on everything because, you know, it's fun to catch cats, and so we're really careful about it. The two main reasons are when we simply don't know enough about the basic biology of the species. And in the case of the jaguar, it's one of the least studied big cats. So we know a lot about lions, we know a lot about tigers, we know a lot about leopards and many other big cats. Jaguars and snow leopards are the two least studied big cat species there are. So just in terms of actually studying the basic natural history, you know, there haven't been many studies since Alan studied jaguars in Belize, you know, almost 3 decades ago, 2-3 decades ago.
I'm sorry to say, yeah.
Which was the first radio collaring study. So I mean, we do have more data than since then, but they're still really poorly studied. The second most important thing is not just that you go out and you want to accumulate data for data's sake, but that information is really important for planning and conservation. And that's key in the Pantanal project and what you actually see in the 60-minute segment, because the reason we're catching jaguars down there is they're living in a human landscape. They're living where there's cattle ranches and their families and all the threats that come with that. And we don't understand that interaction. We need to actually understand how jaguars live in that landscape, whether they are creating the problems that ranchers think by killing cows and how often and under what circumstances that happens. And the only way we're going to be able to understand and address those threats is by the radio collars.
Okay. And the collars, do they affect the cat in any way? Do they hinder the cat's behaviour? They
absolutely don't. You know, radio collaring has been around now for almost 50 years. You know, in the early days they were great, big, cumbersome, horrible things that we would never put on an animal today. You know, the radio collar that we put on that female in the segment, we caught other cats during that trip down there, which weren't featured on the segment. You know, they weigh about 700 grams. You know, which is I mean less than 1% of what a jaguar weighs down there. And we've been doing this for so long, we're very careful about putting on, you know, anything that we think will hamper or affect the behaviour. And the other element to it too is now we build in these little automatic drop-offs. So we actually never have to catch that cat again. They automatically drop off on a pre-date. So 22 months from now, that collar will fire, sends us a signal which we get as an SMS, and we can actually go out and find the collar without actually having to ever handle the cat again.
Right.
So we do minimise it as much as possible.
Right. Least impact to the individual.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Alan, again, a lot of questions about what are we doing with local communities, not just in Brazil, but across Jaguar range. How do we involve them in our efforts? Are we involving them? Number one was the key question, but how so, and how important is that we work with the locals?
This is perhaps the most important thing we can be doing for the future. The days are long past since we believed that the way to save wildlife, especially top carnivores like the jaguar, is just simply to lock them up in a protected area, keep the people out, have nothing to do with the people, and just focus on these big cats or other wildlife in a hard boundary protected area. While protected areas are still and always will be crucial to the survival of jaguars and other wildlife, we know now that the only long-term strategy for the survival of jaguars is to be working with local people, so that local people accept and live with jaguars in a sustainable way, and that jaguars no longer see the hard boundary of a protected area as being where they should turn around, but it's more a permeable boundary, an area where they can then move, sometimes if they have to, into the human landscape, maybe to get to the next area, maybe to get some food. But there needs to be some kind of permeability and some kind of acceptance between jaguars and between people. It's not to say problems won't occur and have to be addressed, but we need to work with local people. And local people have to feel like they're benefiting from what we're asking them to be doing. So just saying, look, jaguars are beautiful and they have the right to exist because we say so, you should not kill jaguars, even though they might be taking your cattle, or you might be afraid for your child's well-being when they go outside. We need to address these issues, and we address it in several ways. Now, It's different where you work because the issues and the problems are different.
Different, you mean different per country, per site?
It's different per country, per site. For instance, one example is at a site within the Jaguar Corridor that we were working on in Costa Rica. The people were just letting their pigs roam free. Jaguars sometimes took their pigs. They weren't in any way doing any kind of animal husbandry or properly utilizing what the pigs could produce beyond meat. We actually went in and built a biodigester for them, a very simplistic biodigester, showed them how to build fencing for the pigs, corral their pigs, decrease interactions with the jaguar, as well as using the scat and the other products made by the pigs for the biodigester. So the people all of a sudden had less problems with the jaguars and now were benefiting from living within jaguar range.
That's a really good example of where it's relevant conservation solutions that make sense to that community. You're solving problems and it's good for both people and jaguars.
That's right. We have other places where we are just now starting to ramp up some educational endeavors where we plan to be building schools and helping with providing teachers and books and some medical partnerships so that people living within Jaguar Range feel lucky to be living there instead of thinking that they're being asked to undergo hardships other people are not.
And so Panthera's Jaguar Corridor initiative is one of our largest initiatives. We're working in 13 out of the 18 Jaguar Range states. We've got a good question from Jennifer. Again, Alan, this is for you. She asked, can you explain how corridors can work to link up far-flung jaguar populations when so much pristine habitat has been converted to agricultural use? Are there enough, and then she also asked, are there enough jaguars to find each other?
That's a very good question. One of the things I need people to understand is that when Panthera is working on this Jaguar Corridor, the idea is not that, say, a jaguar from Mexico moves through that corridor like an Appalachian Trail all the way to, say, a place in Costa Rica or in Brazil. It's that a jaguar is able, through the corridor, usually during dispersal, when young males are starting to come into their own and need to leave and find their own area, they can move outside of the protected area through the human landscape, possibly to the next population. And then a young jaguar from that population is able to move to the next population. It's almost a domino effect in order to maintain the genetic continuity. Are there enough jaguars to be doing this? Interestingly, we don't need many jaguars to be making their way from one population to the next and breeding for this genetic connection, for genetic continuity to occur. It's actually a very small number of jaguars which have to be able to make that path. And with agricultural lands, when we look at the corridors that Panthera are trying to put together, they're not just biological corridors, meaning it's not just a connection of good forest between areas. In some cases, we're using the human landscape. We're using agricultural lands or cattle ranches or citrus groves.
That's all part of the corridor.
It's all part of the corridor. It's a mosaic of land use types that jaguars can move through. And this is why science is so relevant to real-world conservation. Panthera scientists go out and figure out what these jaguars could move through, where they have to live, what their optimal needs are, and then we design corridors according to our scientific knowledge, our biological knowledge of what these jaguars can do.
So we create these plans for how these animals, these big cats, predators, can live in a human-dominated landscape, because that's not just for jaguars, that's across big cats range around the globe. So this leads in for another question for you, Luke, about jaguar attacks. Do jaguar attacks happen on people? And is it strictly a matter of human population density, or are there behavioral influences as well? And this could also be extrapolated to other big cats.
Sure. In the case of jaguars, it's actually amazingly rare. And of all the large cat species, There are astonishingly few documented cases of unprovoked attacks. So jaguars will attack, of course, if you provoke them, and typically wherever there are records, it's usually associated with them being severely provoked, harassed by hunters and dogs and so on, and then of course a jaguar will defend itself, or a female with cubs. But cases of where it's completely unprovoked in the classic sort of man-eater mode are very, very rare, and we only know of probably fewer than you could count them all on one hand over history. In the case of some other cats, of course, lions, tigers, leopards all kill far more people, but even those figures are astonishingly low, and it speaks to, the amazing ability of cats to mostly, not necessarily coexist, but to avoid people. They mostly go out of their way to avoid people, and they don't view people as prey. So, when I think of the opportunities, say, in parts of rural India or parts of remote Africa, where there are lots of people, lots of wildlife, and lots of big cats, the numbers of cases are actually incredibly few. Big cats mostly just go out of their way to avoid people.
And how does that play into sort of the bigger issue, which again we see across the board with big cats, the conflict of human?
Well, that's right, and that's a different thing. And Alan alluded to sort of two sources of conflict with jaguars and people. One is, people are worried about their children being killed by jaguars, an incredibly rare event. Like I say, we have hardly ever documented that. Versus the other case, which is much more common, which is of course jaguars killing livestock, and that is one of the main drivers of conflict between jaguars and people, and indeed between big cats and people around the world. So for the big cats of Africa, it's people and their livestock which are the source of conflict for lions and leopards and cheetahs, and so we really have to address that, and that's one of the things which Panthera is doing, not just in Brazil but all throughout Jaguar's range, and in fact in the case of other big cats. Because cats do kill livestock, we acknowledge that, but we have ways to help reduce that. And if we're successful in bringing a conservation solution, it's going to be to improve the livelihoods of people enough that living with big cats is not the burden that they currently feel.
Right. And as you said, that's a big bulk of what we do across the board, is resolving human-wildlife conflict.
That's probably, literally 80–90% of what we do is not the pure research, putting radio collars on. That's a small part of what we do. It's actually addressing the problems that communities have where they coexist with big cats.
Right.
That's key.
Right. Alan, Emmanuelle wrote us saying that she is planning a trip to the Pantanal next year to see jaguars, and has asked if tourism in the Pantanal has negatively or could potentially negatively affect jaguars.
You're going to have a great time, Emmanuel. You will absolutely see jaguars in the dry season. At this point, we're actually very worried about what you brought up. It's a great topic. It's a very important issue. Observing jaguars, especially the way people are currently doing it, from a boat, from a distance, is not impactful on jaguars to our knowledge. However, the potential is absolutely there, and we've started seeing some of it at certain times for too many people to be trying to converge on too few jaguars at one time. And when they find a jaguar, instead of staying there for a suitable amount of time, taking pictures, having a great experience and leaving, they sit on that jaguar, and the boat sometimes moves closer and closer and closer because every photographer wants the absolute best picture that nobody else has gotten. That is detrimental. Once you start closing that personal space, jaguars don't like people approaching them. If you tried looking at them or doing that same thing on land, the jaguar would move away from you. Up until now, it's felt very comfortable with people sitting in a boat looking at it the way tigers do with people on elephant back in certain parks in India. But as soon as we have started to push the envelope to close that personal space until a jaguar gets annoyed, even if it seems completely relaxed, but eventually it's tired of you being there or coming closer and closer and gets up and moves away, that's negative reinforcement. If that's done continually, we could lose a very good opportunity to have jaguar tourism.
Right. And so,
no, sorry, I was just going to say, Alan, you're absolutely right. And in fact, there was a case last year in Brazil, which we think is a consequence of too much of this pressure, where a jaguar jumped into a boat. It was a boat, and a young boy was severely injured. And that is so atypical for jaguars. And our Brazilian colleagues think that it was because it was constantly pressured and harassed. And so, you know, the rivers are really important to jaguars. I mean, if you're going to converge and sit and watch them, you know, they need they need to cross the rivers, they need to hunt at the rivers, you know, they seek out the rivers for water, of course. So there's got to be some moderation that makes sure that pressure is balanced and it's not, if you have, you know, 24 hours a day you've got boats sitting with a jaguar, I mean, that's really going to have an effect.
It needs to be moderated, controlled, and Panthera can help steer that.
Yeah, that's right. As it is in the better parts of Africa, you know, where people, I think, really take care to make sure that that tourism is done really sensitively for the animals.
So looking at ecotourism and trying to get ahead of this is one of Panthera's top priorities right now in the Pantanal as we move forward.
Right. Another question. Frank from the zoo, we don't know what zoo, but a zoo, asked or said, I'm a volunteer interpreter at a zoo which has jaguars. I enjoy standing at the exhibit, talking with our guests about them. What is the most important thing about jaguars that you, Alan, would want me to share with our guests?
Frank, I think that the most important message you can convey is that these captive jaguars, or the captive animals people are seeing at zoos, are ambassadors. They are ambassadors for the wild animals, for the species living in the wild. That conservation doesn't occur, unfortunately, with that animal which is in a cage, with that captive individual. But what that captive individual could do, and it would serve a phenomenally important purpose, is to make sure that people understand the need of keeping these animals alive in the wild, why wild populations are truly needed, and that for whatever reason this poor animal has found itself in captivity, this itself is not the conservation end, but this animal is speaking for others of its species in trying to convey to people who look at it how they need to be saving and helping the animals in the wild. This is what Panthera's goal is. We aspire to be saving these populations in the wild. And any message that gets through to people about how important that is and how it's done serves that need.
Okay, and we're almost coming to the end. We'll just do 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. But someone just submitted this. Are corridors, this is Luke for you, are the corridors that we're working on, that we're creating, beneficial for other animals besides jaguars or big cats?
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely. And the reason is, you know, I mean, we focus on big cats because they're such good umbrella species. And that applies to whether you're protecting a big core population or trying to maintain or establish corridors. And the reason for that is because, you know, big cats require big spaces. And in those spaces, they require certain resources. Now, if you're talking about a big protected area or big population, you know, they need a lot of space and a lot of prey. Corridors is a little bit different. They need a habitat through which they can move, possibly some prey depending on the length of that corridor, but their demands are going to be much more strict than most other species who end up being able to use that corridor. So in fact, by whether it's a big protected source population or a corridor, if we do a good job of protecting those landscapes in a way that jaguars or big cats in other countries can use, a whole lot of other species get carried along with it.
And that's our model in terms of Panthera. I mean, while we focus on cats, our efforts go so far beyond that.
Exactly. Yeah, we're not interested in the individual cat here and there. We're interested in the species. As Alan was saying, you know, as zoo animals being ambassadors for whole populations, whole species, not, you know, Clarence the lion here or so-and-so the tiger. You know, we're interested in the population, the species.
Right. And so our last question, this is from Rodrigo from Brazil. Alan, he's asked, what are the biggest challenges to securing the Jaguar Corridor, and is Panthera getting enough support?
Some of the biggest challenges that we have are trying to make that very delicate balance between people, human life, human welfare, and animal welfare, and wildlife. While it's easy to talk about a win-win situation, and balancing animals' needs and human needs, it's not always easy to put into practice, because these are two large living groups that often come into conflict with one another. So our greatest challenge, but it's very doable, and Panthera is accomplishing this in an incredible manner, is to both make sure that we maximally save the jaguars and the other wildlife with which it lives. It's provide its optimal habitat, its food, its movement patterns are secure, but at the same time, that people who are asked to live with these animals, despite the occasional problems that will occur, feel good about having these animals alive and around them, because they're benefiting in other positive ways that they couldn't normally. Do we have the resources to make sure all of this happens? Sadly, no, we don't. Panthera needs a lot more resources. We need a lot more help. We need more funding. We need people to come to our website and see what we're doing, so that we can get a mass, a critical mass, and help us push forward on the Jaguar Corridor. We're accomplishing what no one else is accomplishing, but we need your help.
That's a nice way to end. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you
for everyone that tuned in. We really appreciate it. This was our first issue of Cat Chat. So send us an email to info@panthera.org. Let us know what you thought about this. Sign up for our newsletters, follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. We will be running a voting for naming the Jaguar contest. A lot of you submitted names for the Jaguar that was collared in the CBS 60 Minutes segment, so that will be running shortly, so check back on that. And also don't forget that every dollar that you give to Panthera, 100% of that goes to the field where it matters most. So thank you everyone, and we're signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.